Your soulmate broke down crying in a voice message. Please listen before I leave. My beloved child. Your soulmate recorded a voice message they never believed they would have the courage to send. At first, there was only silence. Then a shaky breath. And finally, through tears they could no longer hide, came 6 words that changed the meaning of everything. Please listen before I leave. But what frightened them wasn't simply the thought of leaving you. It was the possibility that you might never understand why. Their voice cracked as they tried to continue, stopping several times as though someone had suddenly stripped away every defense they had spent months building. You could hear movement in the background, a drawer closing, something being placed into a bag, footsteps crossing a quiet room. They weren't speaking dramatically. They sounded defeated. And then they whispered something unexpected. You were right about me. Right about what? That is where the message became impossible to ignore. For weeks, your soulmate had been pretending distance was easier than honesty. They convinced themselves that disappearing quietly would hurt less than admitting what had really happened inside them. But that night, with their belongings packed and a decision already made, the truth finally broke through. I kept waiting for you to stop mattering, they said, their breathing uneven. And somehow you mattered more every day. Then came another pause, long enough that you might have wondered whether the recording had ended. It hadn't. They were crying too hard to speak. Don't skip this, because what followed revealed that their departure wasn't caused by a lack of love. They were running because of something they had hidden from you. Something they believed would completely change how you saw them. And just before revealing it, they admitted they had almost erased the message 3 separate times. Then their tone changed. The sadness was still there, but underneath it was fear. There's something you never knew about the day I pulled away from you, they whispered. I let you believe one thing because telling you the truth would have meant admitting what I did. Suddenly, every unanswered message, every strange silence, every moment when they seemed emotionally present but physically distant carried a different meaning. Your soulmate hadn't simply lost interest. They had been protecting a secret while quietly preparing to disappear before you could discover it yourself. But now, standing somewhere between staying and walking away forever, they couldn't carry it anymore. You could hear a zipper close in the background. A door opened. Then, before the recording ended, they finally said, if you hear what happened that night, you'll understand why I thought leaving you was the only choice. And what happened that night was something you never saw coming. The truth began with a conversation you were never supposed to know happened. Your soulmate admitted that on the very night everything between you suddenly felt different, someone close to them had pulled them aside and revealed something about your relationship that shook their confidence completely. At first, they refused to believe it. They defended you. They even walked away angry. But one sentence followed them home. If you really love them, ask yourself whether you're becoming the reason they can't move forward. Those words planted a fear they couldn't silence. What if loving you wasn't enough? What if their confusion, hesitation, and unfinished problems were slowly hurting the person they cared about most? Instead of asking you, they made a terrible decision alone. They decided you deserved freedom from them. That was why the messages became shorter. Why they suddenly seemed cold when you could still feel something underneath. Your soulmate confessed that every time they ignored the urge to reach out, they would open your conversation, type something, then erase it. One night they wrote, "I miss you more than I can explain," but never pressed send. Another time, they nearly called just to hear your voice. "I thought disappearing would help you forget me," they admitted through tears. "But I was the one who couldn't forget." And then came the detail that changed everything. The person who warned them about holding you back had later returned and admitted they had misunderstood something important. By then, however, your soulmate had already created so much distance that they believed coming back would only reopen the wound. But the voice message wasn't finished. Their footsteps suddenly stopped, and you could hear what sounded like keys being placed on a table. Then their voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I need you to know why I'm leaving tonight," they said. Until that moment, it sounded as though they were simply running from regret. Now it became clear there was a destination, and a deadline. They had made arrangements to begin somewhere new, far enough away that accidentally crossing paths with you would become nearly impossible. Yet they still hadn't walked through the door. Something was holding them there. Stay till the end, because their next confession explained why. "There's one thing I kept from you," they whispered. "And if you knew what I almost did for us before everything fell apart, you might ask me not to go." What they almost did for you had been hidden inside an envelope for months. Your soulmate admitted that before the distance began, they had quietly started planning a future that included you. Not some vague fantasy. Something real. They had looked into changing their work schedule, rearranging responsibilities, and even setting aside money because they wanted to finally stop giving you promises without action. Inside that envelope was confirmation of the first serious step they had taken. "I was going to show you when everything was ready," they whispered. "I wanted you to know I had finally chosen us." But before they could give it to you, that frightening conversation happened. And suddenly they became convinced their plans were selfish rather than loving. Then came another sound in the recording. Paper unfolding. Their breathing grew heavier as they apparently held that same envelope in their hands. "I kept this because throwing it away felt like throwing you away," they said. That confession seemed to break whatever control they had left. Their voice disappeared beneath quiet sobs before returning softer. They admitted they had spent countless nights wondering whether they should tell you everything, but shame always stopped them. What would you say after discovering they had made such a huge decision about your relationship without ever asking what you wanted? They thought silence was sacrifice. Now they understood it had only created confusion. And there was one question they could no longer escape: what if you had been waiting for honesty while they were preparing to vanish? That realization changed the entire voice message. The person who began recording sounded ready to leave. The person speaking now sounded terrified of actually doing it. You could hear the keys again, but this time they weren't being picked up. They were pushed farther across the table. "I don't know if I can walk out that door without giving you one chance to know everything," your soulmate whispered. Then they revealed something even more surprising. The envelope wasn't the only thing they had kept. There was another message, one they had written for you weeks earlier but never sent because it contained the confession they feared most. And before playing it, your soulmate said quietly, "This is the moment I realized I wasn't leaving because I stopped loving you. I was leaving because I loved you enough to be terrified of what you might say when you knew the whole truth. The unsent message began with an admission your soulmate had never spoken aloud. I knew I was losing you, and I still pretended I was fine. Their voice trembled as they read the words they had written weeks earlier. They described watching the distance grow between you while secretly hoping you would somehow see through it. Every cold response had been followed by regret. Every silence had been filled with thoughts of reaching for you. But one line exposed the deepest wound. I wanted you to stop me without ever giving you a reason to. They finally understood how unfair that had been. You were expected to recognize a love they were deliberately hiding. And when you respected their distance instead of chasing them, they mistook your silence for proof that leaving was the right decision. But there was more inside that message. Your soulmate admitted they had nearly contacted you on one particular night. Your name was already on their screen. Their finger hovered over the call button. Then something happened that stopped them. A notification appeared, connected to the plans they had once made for the two of you. It was a reminder that a deadline was approaching. They could either cancel what they had arranged or move forward with it. For several minutes, they simply stared at those two choices. That was when I realized I had built an entire future around someone I was too scared to speak to, they said. Instead of calling you, they canceled part of the plan. But not all of it. One piece remained untouched because somewhere inside them, hope had refused to die. Then the recording grew strangely quiet. No crying. No footsteps. Just a long breath before your soulmate said, "This is the part I'm most afraid to tell you." That remaining piece wasn't something small or symbolic. It required a decision from them before morning, which explained why they had packed their belongings and why tonight felt final. If they left, that last connection to the future they once imagined with you would disappear with them. But if they stayed, they would have to face you without excuses and finally ask the question they should have asked months ago. Their voice cracked again. "I don't need you to promise me anything," they whispered. "I just need to know whether I destroyed something you still wanted." Then came the revelation they had been avoiding. Before recording this message, they had already written one final question addressed directly to you, and your answer could determine whether they walked out that door. That final question was painfully simple. If I had told you the truth sooner, would you have asked me to stay? Your soulmate could barely finish reading it. For months, they had imagined your answer without ever giving you the chance to speak for yourself. They convinced themselves you had moved on. They interpreted your quietness as closure and your strength as proof that you no longer needed them. But now, with their bags packed and the night slipping away, they admitted something devastating. They had been watching for one tiny sign that the door between you wasn't completely closed. Not because they expected you to chase them. They simply needed to know whether there was still something worth fighting for. And then they confessed that a sign had already appeared. They had simply been too frightened to trust it. It happened only days earlier. Your soulmate had come across something connected to you that brought back a memory they had tried desperately to bury. Suddenly, they remembered a conversation where you had told them that honesty mattered more than perfection. At the time, those words seemed ordinary. Now they felt like an answer arriving too late. "You never asked me to have everything figured out," they whispered. "I put that pressure on myself. That realization shattered the story they had been telling themselves. Maybe you hadn't needed them to disappear and become someone better somewhere else. Maybe you had only needed them to stop hiding. Their crying returned, quieter now, almost exhausted. Then they admitted the most painful part. The person they had been trying to protect you from was never really themselves. It was rejection. And that fear had nearly cost them everything. Your soulmate picked up their keys again, but this time the sound carried a different meaning. "I'm not leaving yet," they said suddenly. 4 words. A complete reversal from the beginning of the message. But they weren't promising to stay forever either. They had decided to wait long enough for one final act of courage. Before walking away, they wanted to send you something along with the voice message, something that would prove their confession wasn't simply emotion spoken in a desperate moment. It was evidence of the future they had once quietly prepared for you. You could hear the envelope opening again. Then your soulmate whispered, "There's a date written on this paper. When you see when I made this decision, you'll realize I loved you long before I ever had the courage to admit how serious this was." And that date was about to change everything you thought you knew. The date on that paper came from a time when you believed your soulmate was still uncertain about you. That was what made it so powerful. While their words had seemed cautious, their private actions were telling a completely different story. They had made the decision only days after one quiet moment between you, a moment you probably assumed meant far more to you than it did to them. But they remembered everything. The way you listened without judging. The way you never demanded promises. The way being around you made the future feel less frightening. That night, they said, struggling to keep their voice steady, "I went home and realized I didn't want a temporary place in your life." Yet instead of telling you, they began preparing privately, believing they should only speak once they could prove they were serious. Now the tragedy became clear. The very plan meant to bring you closer had helped create the distance between you. Your soulmate became obsessed with getting everything right before revealing their feelings. Every delay made them more anxious. Every misunderstanding made them question whether they were already too late. Then came that conversation warning them they might be holding you back, and their confidence collapsed completely. "I thought loving you meant stepping aside," they whispered. "I never asked whether stepping aside was what you wanted." There was no excuse in their voice anymore. Only recognition. They finally understood that making a painful choice for someone without allowing them a voice isn't protection. And as they stared at that old date, another truth hit them. They had been planning their departure with the same mistake. They were deciding your future without you again. That was when you heard the suitcase move. Not toward the door. Away from it. Your soulmate took a long breath and said something completely different from the desperate person who had started the recording. "I can't leave like this." But what happened next made the message even more intense. They admitted there was still one final complication, something they hadn't mentioned because it could make staying much harder than simply choosing love. Their departure wasn't only emotional. Someone was expecting them somewhere else by morning, and backing out now would carry real consequences for the new life they had arranged. Still, your soulmate had made one decision: they would not disappear without letting you choose what happened next. Then their voice lowered. "There's one last thing you need to hear before you answer me. Someone contacted me today, and what they told me about you is the reason I finally pressed record. The person who contacted your soulmate wasn't trying to bring you together. In fact, their message was almost casual. They mentioned that you seemed ready to move forward with your life. Those words should have made leaving easier. Instead, your soulmate felt something inside them collapse. For the first time, losing you stopped being an imaginary fear and became a possibility they could no longer control. I stared at that message for 10 minutes, they admitted. Then I realized I had no right to be heartbroken. I was the one who taught you how to live without me. That realization sent them back through every conversation, every unanswered feeling, every moment when you offered closeness and they responded with uncertainty. Suddenly, they understood that waiting another day might mean finally becoming the stranger they had pretended they were prepared to be. But something about that message bothered them. The person claimed you were moving forward, yet they also mentioned one detail that suggested your feelings weren't as simple as they appeared. Apparently, when your soulmate's name came up, you didn't respond with anger. You didn't pretend they meant nothing. You became quiet. Just for a moment. That tiny detail was enough to stop them from walking through the door. I know silence doesn't mean you're waiting for me, they said carefully. And I won't turn it into something it isn't. But it made me realize I never actually gave you the truth. That was the turning point. They weren't asking you to rescue them from consequences. They weren't demanding another chance. They simply couldn't accept beginning a new life knowing the old one had ended because of assumptions neither of you had ever been allowed to challenge. Then came the sound you had been waiting for since the beginning of the recording. The suitcase zipper opened again. Your soulmate slowly began unpacking. I told them I might not be coming tomorrow, they whispered, referring to the person expecting them by morning. Their voice was still emotional, but something had changed. Fear was finally giving way to courage. They had postponed the departure. Not cancelled it. Not yet. Because one conversation still had to happen, and this time they refused to make your decision for you. Then they revealed why the voice message had become so long. It wasn't meant to be their goodbye anymore. It was meant to lead into something far more frightening. When this recording ends, they said, I'm going to do the one thing I've been terrified to do for months. A breath. A trembling pause. I'm going to call you. And if you answer, there's one question I need to ask before either of us decides what happens next. The question they wanted to ask wasn't, do you still love me? Your soulmate knew that would be too easy, too selfish, and far too late after everything they had put you through. Instead, they whispered, I need to ask whether there is still enough trust left for one completely honest conversation. Their voice was calmer now, but every word carried the weight of what might happen next. They understood that love could survive distance while trust could quietly disappear beneath it. And for the first time, they weren't asking you to forget the silence or excuse the choices they had made. They were prepared to hear your anger, your disappointment, even the possibility that you had already chosen a different future. I just don't want our last chapter to be something I wrote for both of us without asking you, they said. Then came a quiet sound, the suitcase being pushed completely away. For several seconds, your soulmate said nothing. Then they confessed what they would do if you answered the call. They would tell you everything without hiding behind fear, why they pulled away, what they had planned for the two of you, why they nearly left, and what that old date on the paper truly represented. More importantly, they would finally listen. Maybe I've spent so long being afraid of your answer that I forgot you deserved the chance to give one, they admitted. Their crying had almost stopped now. What remained was vulnerability without performance. No dramatic promises. No pressure. Just someone realizing that love could never be protected through silence. And then, unexpectedly, tea.